Good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today and ready to continue in our study through Luke's account of the life of Christ. And we are in Luke chapter 22 today. And I've already got up here on the screen what we covered yesterday. We covered about the first 38 verses yesterday. So we're going to finish up today, hopefully. Got a few on here. Good morning, Mark. Good morning, Danny. Good morning, Darla from Ohio. So it looks like we got 3 states right now. Missouri, Arkansas, and Ohio. How about that? Glad to see everybody on here today. So, again, we're in the last hours of the life of Christ on earth, and as we approach verse 39 of Luke chapter 22, we are in the garden, or we're heading towards the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, you can look at the other gospel accounts and read about this. Some are more extensive, more detailed than others. That's why we have 4 gospel accounts, to give us as many details as the Holy Spirit determined was necessary. So it says, coming out, he's celebrated the Passover. He's established the Lord's Supper with his disciples. They're leaving and coming out. Goes to the Mount of Olives as he was accustomed, and his disciples also followed him. When he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that ye may not enter into temptation." And again, and we've talked about this to some extent, Jesus knows what's getting ready to happen. I mean, throughout Luke's gospel account and also Matthew, Mark, and John, we see multiple times where Jesus tells his disciples, we're heading to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed, beaten, crucified. You guys are going to be scattered. It's his time. His hour is here. And so he again, knowing what's going to happen, pray that you may not enter into temptation. So he goes about a stone's throw from them. Got my words backwards there. And he knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if it is your will." This is so important here. I think we learn a lot about the mindset of Christ and the prayer life of Christ here in verses 39 through 53. If it is your will. You know, sometimes in life when we go to pray, what do you pray for? Maybe going through something personal on an individual level. You may be going through something as a family. As a Christian, you may be going through something as a congregation, maybe where you go to church. Maybe it's a national deal. I mean, our nation is crazy right now. The world is absolutely crazy right now. And, sometimes it may be the case that when we go to God in prayer, we don't know what to say. How do you word it? How do you express it? That's why I love Romans chapter 8, verses 26 and 27. It tells us that there are times that we don't know what we should pray as we ought. The Holy Spirit takes care of that. He is able to present to the Father groanings that cannot be uttered, things that we cannot express, feelings that we may be having, emotions that we're dealing with. God knows our heart. The divine beings know our mind, know what we're going through. And when we pray, we have that assurance. So when I'm looking here at the prayer of Jesus in the garden, if it be your will. Now, Jesus knows very well what the will of the Father is. He knows he knows why he came to earth. This is his mission. But I see the humanity of Christ in this prayer. He knows he's going to be beaten. He knows he's going to be put to death. He's going to be executed, okay? He knows this. He's going to be crucified. He's read Isaiah chapter 53. I see the humanity of Christ in this prayer. If it is possible, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Now, we know he prays this 3 times. Luke here only records for us once, but this is a picture, a brief image, a snapshot of the humanity of Christ. And it's not that we don't see it in other places throughout the Gospels, because we do. But this one's really, to me, really touching because of what's going on. He is in such agony. So verse 41 tells, or I'm sorry, there we go, verse 44. Agony. The Greek word there means he's in a struggle. He's in a wrestling. He's in such a state, both physically and emotionally, that Luke records for us that an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And Luke records another bit of information for us here. Being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. The word that Luke uses there in verse 44, like great drops of blood, is a term. It's not a comparison. It's a term describing a condition. His sweat became bloody. And I know there's some disagreement. That's what I see here when I look at the language here, but also going back to the Greek language, he is, and this is an actual medical condition known as hematidrosis. He's in such agony. He's under so much stress. He knows what he's getting ready to go through, that it takes an angel from heaven to strengthen him. Again, this is a great image here, a great reminder for us that Jesus was just like us. It's like Hebrews chapter 2 says in verses 14 through 18. He didn't take on the nature of angels. He took on the seed of Abraham. He took on flesh just like he existed just like we exist. We see it here. As he's praying, some interesting things happen. While he was still speaking, behold, a multitude. Now, I want to point something out here. I want to stop just for a minute here. Luke uses the word multitude. So I'm going to take my Bible over to John chapter 18 and show you something here. John's record of this, verse 3, okay? So I'll just begin in John 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden where he and his disciples entered. So you have John's record of what Luke's talking about in Luke 22 here. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Now listen to what John records here. Luke says a multitude. John says, then Judas, having received, the New King James says, a detachment of troops. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, but if I'm not mistaken, the King James says that he got a band of soldiers. This detachment of troops is the Greek term is actually a military term, and it means a group of at least 600 soldiers. A lot of times the imagery we have is of the arrest of Jesus. Judas is kissing him. There may be a few guys there with swords and clubs and torches and things like this. John uses a very descriptive and definite term here. This is not a small group of people who have come to arrest Jesus. Again, this is a military term. 600 soldiers come with Judas. Then you go down to John 18, verse 12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. Not only do you have Judas and the detachment of troops, you've got the officers of the Jews there. You've got other people there. This is a massive crowd that has come to arrest Jesus. Judas, identifies who he's going to betray with a kiss. And Jesus simply says, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Of course, this is fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy here in verse 48. Prophecy after prophecy being fulfilled here. We know what happens. This is the guy, all right? Here's the one that you need to arrest. He'd already agreed for a certain amount of money, 30 pieces of silver. You go back to the first 4 or 5 verses, actually the first 6 verses of Luke 22. And now Judas is fulfilling his promise to betray Jesus into the hands of this detachment of troops. And again, I don't think that's insignificant, the language that John uses there, and how Jesus was arrested here. And then what's going to proceed from this moment on, and how he's treated by this detachment of troops, and by the Sanhedrin and others who deal with him in his arrest. Okay, so when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. You go to John chapter 18, you read verses 10 and 11, you know that was Peter who took out his sword and cut off Malchus's right ear. So Wayne asked, why so many just to arrest one man? That's a good question, Wayne. They knew who he was. He's raised people from the dead on multiple occasions. And again, he's performed miracles. So I mentioned that one miracle in particular because when you read John 11, his enemies witness this miracle. They can't deny it. You get to John chapter 12 and their solution is, hey, let's kill Lazarus. They know the power that he has. I mean, it's been evidenced multiple times through his miracles. That may be one reason as to why so many. Maybe they feared a retaliation from his multitude of followers. That I don't know. There's not really a good one single verse that I can point out that says here's why they use so many. But it's quite something to understand the language that's used here. Hundreds of people are sent when he's arrested. Don't do that, Peter. He cuts off servant's ear. Permit this. And he touched his ear and healed him. So there again, there's another. And I wonder what the detachment of troops, they see that. I wonder what their response is to that, to the fact that he touches his ear and heals him once Peter cuts it off. And so he simply says this: have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? Have I been some kind of violent revolutionary? Have I been some kind of violent criminal? Well, of course not. When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Notice that phrase, this is your hour and the power of darkness. Think about that. This is all part of what we call the scheme of redemption. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission, Hebrews 9:22. But it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin, Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 4. It's going to take a perfect human sacrifice. But there's a lot of darkness involved in the fulfillment of the scheme of redemption. This is their hour, and they're going to take advantage of it. It's really a sad scene here when we see this. So all the way down through verse 62, beginning in verse 54, we have Peter's denial. Now he's just said not long ago, Lord, I'll die with you. I'm not afraid to go to prison only. I will die with you. That's Luke 22 and verse 33. All right, Peter, here you go. Here's your chance. I'm not going to read all of this. So Jesus has been arrested, and Luke notes that Peter follows at a distance. Okay, I mentioned this yesterday. Strike the shepherd, the sheep will be scattered. Peter follows at a distance. He stands around a fire in the courtyard. Here's number 1, verse 56. This man was also with him. No, I don't know him. Little while, another saw him and said, you are also of them. Peter said, no, man, I am not. Then about an hour passed, another confidently affirmed. Again, notice how Luke records that. Confidently affirmed. Surely this fellow was this fellow is a Galilean. Man, I don't know what you are saying. Now, and I didn't make a note of this, but one of the gospel writers said your speech betrays you. In other words, the language, the way you're talking, I know you were with him. Every opportunity Peter gets to stand up, the guy who's just said, I will go to prison and die with you. Here's your chance. I don't know him. I think it's unfair for us to say what we would do. Sometimes we can, today, it's easy for us to be reading this passage safely in our house and say, oh, I would never have done that. You better be careful with what you say. When you're put on the spot, when you're put in the situation, you might change your mind. Peter said it in a comfortable setting, alone with Jesus and the others. Here's his chance. And I want you to notice what Luke records here. Immediately, okay? 3 denials. Immediately, as he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. Now notice this. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Think about that look. Peter, again, hey, I'll die with you, I'll go to prison. The rooster won't crow till you've denied me 3 times, Peter. I wonder what that look was on Christ's face when this happened. Again, Peter's following at a distance, verse 54. But Jesus knew right where he was because he looked at him. Something to think about. What's his response? He remembered the word of the Lord, how he said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. The Greek says there that he burst into tears. He knew. And I think him knowing that, remembering what the Lord said, coupled with the Lord turned and looked at him, he couldn't help it. Peter, he's ambitious. He seems to be a strong man, a strong-willed man. He wants to do what's right. And I think that's seen by his reaction here. Judas goes out and hangs himself. Peter repents. And I think that touches on what we looked at yesterday. When you are converted, strengthen your brethren. Peter's a different kind of man than Judas was. I don't think Judas, so when you look at Matthew 27 and the first 5 verses there, I don't think Judas realized exactly what was going to happen when he betrayed Jesus. I really don't. He knew he was going to betray him. He knew he was going to get a certain amount of money, but I don't think that he fully comprehended the consequences of his actions. Peter didn't in the moment, but when Jesus looked at him and he remembered Jesus' words, he knew immediately. You've got 2 different types of people here. Peter runs out and weeps bitterly. So then we go from verses 63 to 71. And the Gospels, and again, one of the things that we learn here in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to me, is the richness of the Greek language here, telling us what happens to Jesus. It's not just the crucifixion that he suffers through. All right, so let's look at some of this language here. Verse 63 beginning, now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face. These words here, I'm going to look at a couple of other gospel accounts. These words here, beat, struck, spit, slapped, all of these words that the writers use. So let me flip over here to John real quick while I'm doing this. So John 19, verse 3, they struck him with their hands. All right, let me turn back to Mark's account. Mark 15 and verse 19. Then they struck him on the head with a reed. And then I'm going to flip back to Matthew's account. Matthew chapter 26, verse 67. They spat in his face. They beat him. They struck him with the palms of their hands. Every one of those words are in the active voice in the Greek language. Some of them are in the imperfect, which is a past tense. Some of them are in the aorist tense, which is another form of past. One is more definite past than the other. But every one of them is in the active voice. And do you realize what that means? It's not just one guy hitting him and one guy hitting him once. This detachment of troops that have arrested him, they are beating him. Whether you're looking at the imperfect tense active voice or the aorist tense active voice of the Greek language, this beating goes on and on. They keep slapping him in the face. They keep spitting in his face. They keep punching him. So the King James uses this word buffet. They buffeted him. And that word in the Greek language means they punched him in the face. Matthew 26? They were slapping him with the palms of their hands. Other guys were making a fist and they were punching him in the face over and over and over again. And again, these guys are soldiers. These are trained professionals. What he went through on the cross is just the end. When he was nailed to the cross, hung there for 6 hours, and died. This physical beating began in the garden, and they beat him, again, spit on him all night, abused him physically like this all night long. And you know what that tells me about Jesus? He was a strong man. He was a carpenter. So a lot of people have this image of Jesus that he's just kind of this soft, pushover, emasculated, effeminate, never raises his voice kind of guy. If he were a soft man like that, he wouldn't have lasted all night long. He's bleeding all night. He's being abused physically all night. And then he hangs for 6 hours. This is a strong man physically. Now, so think back to the prayer in the garden. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass. I understand why he prayed that. But the language here is so rich, and we need to do a little digging to understand what he did for us. So I've got a few comments I've not looked at here, going back to the, Judas's action and his, why so many people. One, Mark says, he has been surrounded before and simply walked through them, and Judas had seen this. Absolutely true. That had happened. He followed close enough for a glance. I told you so, referring to the look that Jesus gave to Peter. I always thought that Judas thought he would escape as before. Very possible, Mark, very possible. David says, he did so much for humanity that if people are lost and wind up in hell, it's their own choice. Yeah, I tell you, what we're reading here is brutal language. Then Mark says, active is continually, just as in the word cleanse in 1 John 1:7. Yeah, we must walk in the light, continue to walk in the light, and the blood of his Son will continue to cleanse us from sin. Absolutely. Hey, Pat, good to see you on here today. So, again, this language of Luke 22:63-71, but also the other gospel accounts, are extremely descriptive when you do a little bit of digging. So, studies like this are important for us. So where were we? Okay, so we're at Luke 22, verse 64. And here's another thing. Not only are they beating him and spitting on him, they've got him blindfolded. Man. And as they're punching him, prophesy. Who is the one who struck you? This, I tell you what this is. This is what we're seeing in our streets today in the United States of America. And I'm not in any way comparing Jesus to the individual. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is the actions that we see on the part of some today, the mob violence, that's what Jesus was suffering. And he was an innocent man. So that just gives us a little bit of a picture to help us understand the mob mentality that a lot of people have. A lot of people in a mob will do things that as an individual, they would never have the courage to do. Never. Because they're not strong enough mentally, they're not strong enough physically, but you get a group of people together, and now suddenly they find courage. You can't get much of a bigger coward than that type of a person who follows a mob. Anyway, many other things they blasphemously spoke against him, verse 65. So then we continue down through verse 66. He now faces the Sanhedrin. So here's one thing we need to understand. When Jesus is arrested, he's on trial all night, and he goes through 5 different trials, of course ending with Pilate. But he goes to the high priest, to Annas and Caiaphas. He goes to Pilate. He goes to Herod. He's sent back to Pilate. And the whole time he's being beaten. The whole time. He's being abused and blasphemed against as soon as it was day. So that again indicates what Luke writes here in verse 66. This has gone on all night. The elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into the council, saying, the Sanhedrin, if you are the Christ, tell us, what has he been doing for 3 years? It's not that he hasn't told them. It's not that the evidence is not there with the teachings and with the miracles. If you were the Christ, tell us. And he says, if I tell you, you will by no means believe. And that's just the point. He's told them for 3 years. It's like John records in John chapter 5. Jesus said, the very works that I do, they testify of me. Wasn't enough. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. He knows. He knows why he's here. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. Are you the Son of God? You said it. Now they just, as we say, they blow their stack. It's all over. Now he's in the presence of the Sanhedrin. Now he's called himself the Son of God, which in the Jewish frame of mind, in Jewish context, when a man called himself another person's son, that made him equal with that person. When Jesus calls himself the Son of God, he is equaling himself with God. What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. Verse 71. This was what it was coming to. This is where it was ending. Again, he knows why he came. He understood his purpose. But all of these events just show the level of hypocrisy and wickedness within the Jewish leadership system. Whether we're talking about the chief priests or the scribes or the Pharisees or here the Sanhedrin, which was made up of the Sadducees, their hypocrisy knows no bounds. It's amazing. Yeah, Deborah says, much like dogs, one wouldn't go for the kill in a herd, but if it has one or two with it, they will run through a herd, killing and maiming. Yeah, and that's what these people are acting like. They're acting like animals, and there's nothing wrong with saying that because that's exactly how they're behaving. Wayne comments with John 15 and verse 13 here. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And I want you to think about that. Thank you for sharing that verse, Wayne. So in this larger context, Jesus has just washed the disciples' feet, right? John chapter 13. So listen to John 13, verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Do you realize who was in that number when that was recorded? When he was washing their feet? Judas. He was there. And Jesus loved them to the end. I tell you, that shows us the meaning of John 15:13. And when Judas came to betray him with a kiss, that's what Jesus said. Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? And Jesus calls him, I forget which gospel writer says it, friend? Are you going to betray me with a kiss? So, as we enter Luke 23, which we'll get back to tomorrow, Jesus goes to Pilate, and then to Herod, and then back to Pilate. The whole time, he's being abused, suffering unjustly. And that's what Isaiah says when he was taken, what Isaiah means when he says he was taken from justice, or taken from judgment. He did not receive justice. It was taken away from him. Isaiah said, who will declare his generation? Who's going to stand up for him? Nobody stood up for him. But that's why he came. And again, so what I looked at there in John 13, verse 1, having known that it was his hour. He knew. That's why he prayed the way he prayed in the garden. If it is your will, let this cup pass. He knew. And to me, that even makes it more, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but it gives it more meaning. Because he knew. And he had the power to stop it. And he didn't. Yeah, so here's a good comment. I've not seen what you're talking about, but it's a good point. There's a meme that says, when you can sit at the table with your Judas, you will know what love is. Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what he did. And he died for Judas, and for me, and for you. Okay, so that's Luke chapter 22. I really appreciate all of you being on here today and all the comments. I always enjoy your comments and encourage them. Questions, hey, throw them in here. Send me a private message, put them in our comments section here. I'll be happy to address them. Plan is, Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow morning at 11 Central Time, and we will start looking at Luke chapter 23. So I hope that you have a good day, and hope to see you back here tomorrow.